Hello and welcome to Conscious Curiosities, where we unlock the wisdom of the universe which lies within us. I'm Maria Luz, your host, a certified hypnotist, astrologer, and psychic medium. Today's episode is entitled How to See Themes in Your Birth Chart. In this episode, I'll cover the concept of themes in the birth chart, a few methods for identifying major themes, and some ideas for further exploration. As I was thinking about what would be most useful to people as they up their astrology game, the idea of themes emerged. And this is really where the left brain meets the right brain, in my opinion. So buckle up if you're not used to merging those two together. And we may not see it, but astrology is largely math, history, psychology, and sociology, or maybe sociobiology. And I think a couple of things recently planted the seed for this episode. One was this documentary on the sociobiologist E.O. Wilson on PBS. And Wilson was a professor at Harvard and a biologist who sort of kicked humans off of their pedestal by raising the idea that our biology drives much of our behavior with others, much in the way that he observed this happen in the ant colonies that he spent most of his career up until that point researching. And so when he did start making those observations about the parallels with, humans and what we did in groups, with what he saw happening in ants, it kind of caused this huge controversy, and he was persecuted for a while, actually. Anyway, it's a super interesting documentary. It's not just about him. It's him presenting his thought process and how he did the research. And for anyone interested in nature or how humans interact, or even how science is done, and the competition and all of that goes on with academia and the public perception, I can't recommend it enough. And the other recent, prod to do this, it's funny because I talked about the things that planted the seed, and the other one is my herbalist program that I've been working in since May. And although most herbalists have an extensive library of books, a large part of this, what I think is super empowering information, has been and continues to be passed on verbally through a lot of storytelling. And I love the way Matthew Wood, who the institute where I study is named after, how he describes this meeting of the left and right brain. He says, intuition refers to the ability to see the whole pattern one is examining. And I think I heard him say that in one of the classes, and I wrote it down on my ever-growing Matthew Wood quotes that I love, little piece of paper. And when I saw that, the two halves of my brain just did a high five. Because patterns are repeatable. Therefore, there is a mathematical logic underneath. However, seeing the whole requires something further. So if possible, look at your birth chart while I walk through this information today. And in order to make this work, I have to operate on the assumption that you've listened to my previous episodes, or at least have a beginner understanding of astrological archetypes and that type of information. However, I will also tell you some stories that will help you get the gist of how to do this with your own chart. So feel free to just listen along, and I know that you will still absorb something helpful. I originally was going to leave math out of this episode, and I was able to do that for the most part, but we will get to a part where it gets a little bit mathy, but we won't get bogged down in all the different aspects, aspect patterns, phasal relationships of the different planets, and all of that, because that would just be a little bit too much to juggle in this one episode. So take a look at your birth chart if it's there in front of you, and just see visually, is there any general pattern or a lack thereof in how the planets are placed around that wheel? So are they splattered, pretty evenly throughout? Are they concentrated in the upper or lower hemisphere, or on the left half or the right half? And if something stands out to you, make a note. And in general, if there is a concentration of planets in the upper hemisphere, well, that indicates more of a public-facing life. And if there are more in the lower hemisphere, generally a more at home, or as I guess a more confined life. And if there are more planets on the left, that indicates more focus on the self, and more on the right indicates more focus on others. And this doesn't mean that every day will reflect these themes, but just the overall lifetime themes. And now see if there are any houses or any signs that contain 3 or more planets, and include the north node and the south node, and if you have Chiron plotted on your birth chart as well. As an aside, I think Chiron is becoming, just as important as the other planets that we've been working with for thousands of years, or hundreds of years in the case of the ones discovered after a telescope. But anyway, that's an aside. So if you've got those situations where there are 3 or more planets in a house or in a sign, that configuration is called a stellium. And just circle any of those on your chart. And the energies associated with this sign or house will likely be a theme in your life. And this information may also provide you with some validation or direction. And an example is when I was first learning astrology and noticed that I have a stellium in Virgo, and it includes Pluto in a conjunction with Mercury. And a conjunction again is when they're very close together. So say 5 or depends on the planet, 5 degrees, let's say. If it's your sun or moon, we generally extend it to about 10 degrees to call it a conjunction. And my south node is also in Virgo. And we'll get to this later, but my south node is in a conjunction with my sun, even though my sun is in Leo. So I have this Virgo stellium situation. And this explained to me why one of my natural strengths is just a very organized and analytical mind. And because of the conjunction to my sun, it also explains why I've often been selected, I have often selected and just approached mental, pursuits more like a Virgo than a Leo. And, when I say more like a Virgo than a Leo, that's where kind of your knowledge of the archetypes will come in handy, because you may have a stellium in a sign that you aren't super fluent in, because it's not your sun or your moon or your rising. So anyway, just write down any, initial insights that you have based on these types of clusters in your chart. And another thing, just don't stress about too much about exact, or if you have questions, like just write them down and you can always email me with your questions. I'm happy to answer those. So moving on, I want to look at your ascendant or your rising sign. And remember, that is the one that's on the left-hand side. That would be, I always mess this up, but I think it's the 9 o'clock position if it were an old-fashioned clock face. And so you'll look at that sign there. You might also have a table that came with your chart that shows an AS or an ASC, and it says what sign it's in. And then what we're going to do is we'll determine which planet or planets rule that sign. And the way that Hellenistic, so, ancient Greece, the way that they assigned rulership, it began with the moon and the sun in the 4th and the 5th house position, which are, if you remember, the 4th house is home and the 5th house is children. And then they worked their way out from there. So they went to the next adjacent, which would be the 3rd and the 6th. And they started assigning the visible planets, so Mercury through Saturn, from the nearest, most adjacent to the furthest from the moon and the sun. And it's hard to kind of explain it without showing you. But that's why you may ask, like, well, how did these signs end up on these houses? Well, that's how. And then later, as empirical observation associated the further planets that were discovered by telescope, as astrologers started making observations about when those planets were in certain, positions, what were we seeing in that person whose chart had those positions, or when they were in certain positions in the sky, what was happening on Earth. And so then they were able to add those newer planets, so Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, as, say, modern rulership for the signs as well. So I'm going to read out the signs and their associated rulerships, and then I'm going to explain a little bit about the ascendant, or maybe a lot, actually. So Aries, the ruler is Mars, Taurus, Venus, Gemini, Mercury, Cancer, the moon, Leo, the sun, Virgo, Mercury, Libra, Venus, Scorpio, Mars and Pluto, Sagittarius, Jupiter, Capricorn, Saturn, Aquarius, Saturn and Uranus, Pisces, Jupiter, and Neptune. And although the term ascendant can mean a few different things to astrologers depending on the context, you may also, as I mentioned, you may also see like an AS or an ASC on your chart with a line, and that will show you which sign it's in as well. So anyway, that's based on which sign. So those are kind of like the representations of the constellations, which sign or constellation was on the eastern horizon at the time of your birth and from the location of your birth. And so that's why that information is super important when astrologers are calculating your birth chart, or I guess I should say when apps are calculating it nowadays. So the ascendant or the rising sign is, as astrologer Stephen Forrest, who I often quote on this show, how he puts it, the ascendant is how you dawn on people and how we express ourselves behaviorally. And maybe that was, the connection that like formed a synapse in my head when I was watching that E.O. Wilson sociobiology documentary. So Anyway, I'll likely do an entire episode on the ascendant, but for today, let's focus on its planetary rulers. And just some more from Stephen Forrest. He wrote, the planet that happens to rule the ascendant partakes of that same exaggeratedly active behavioral quality. For that reason, it always aims the spotlight at where the person's life is happening. What theaters of behavior are chronically emphasized in his or her biography. And once you have identified the planets ruling your ascendant sign, identify the sign that ruling planet or planets are in, and then the house, and then anything notable about it. And I'll use mine as an example. My rising sign is at 0 degrees 48 minutes of Scorpio, which means it is ruled by both Mars and Pluto. Mars is in Leo in the 10th house, and it makes a conjunction to my sun and to the south node, also both in the 10th house. So, and if you remember our earlier little convo about stelliums, that means my south node is actually involved in 2 stelliums, in the Virgo stellium with Pluto and Mercury, and in a 10th house stellium with Mars and Leo. So this tells me that themes having to do with my core vitality, so sun, leadership or self-expression, that would be the Leo part, and inherent abilities, so the south node, it represents that, showing up in the area of career or legacy in the 10th house, and also weaving in the sign of Scorpio, my ascendant sign, which is about like digging deep, or in my case, it ended up being research, will be significant in my life. And of course, I am greatly distilling down the meanings of all of these archetypes, but even this very superficial analysis is accurate when I review the themes in my life so far. And I'll go through this same process for Pluto first, because Pluto's the co-ruler of Scorpio with Mars. And then I'll just explain how these themes have just been prominent, like in spades in my life. So as I mentioned earlier, Pluto is conjunct Mercury in Virgo, and they are in the 11th house, which is a house that's related to groups. And the energy of Mercury is around perception. And in Virgo, it analyzes and categorizes. It likes organization. Pluto tends to intensify whatever it touches. And from an evolutionary astrology lens, I can see from other things as well, but I can see specifically that my soul has been working on this Pluto and Mercury pair, this pair of energies for many lifetimes, just because of their the degrees that they're and position around the wheel that they are from each other. So I know that it will be especially strong. So what this chart ruler blueprint yielded in my life, one very literal example is that for many years in my career, so that's the 10th house, I was a leader, that's the Leo, of organizations, which is 11th house. And my work was analytical, that's the Mercury, and throwing in the Scorpio as well, had to everything to do with research, and was also very detailed, which is another Virgo component. And I literally earned my master's in organizational leadership. Like, you can hardly get more literal. And my south node was really anchoring me because of that conjunction with my sun, and being part of that stellium with Pluto and Mercury. It was like this weight. It was anchoring me into where I have excelled in past lives as someone leading others through some complex, left brain work, which means it also meant for me to learn lessons in order to find really the opposite, where my North Node sits, to find my spirituality, because it's in Pisces. That has ultimately replaced my family of origins conditioning, because the North Node sits in the fourth house. And when I began studying astrology, the sign of Pisces was just so uncomfortable and difficult for me to understand. And I think if I had learned astrology earlier, I would have been prompted just to question, like, why was I so heavily anchored to just going in this one direction? And it wasn't necessarily that it wasn't at all that I had a plan to become that. But it was like life was pulling me in that direction very strongly. And I just had the aptitudes that lined me up for the things that were being offered to me. So if I had known astrology, I would have been like, that, there would have been like this warning bell, like, wait a minute, why is all this happening so perfectly? Or I guess when you're looking at an evolution standpoint, not so perfect for that. But because I didn't know that, I kind of just stayed with the inertia, and I didn't make it a point to learn about what did I believe, or how did I, do my spirituality. And there are many other things in my chart pointing to these hidden gifts for a fluency with Pisces type energies, like psychic abilities, being able to help others really transform and heal. And this is why I would love for young people, I mean all people, but especially when they have time to maybe do some of that investigation before they get just unconsciously pulled. And, I'd love for them to be able to understand their charts, because I suspect that many of us have had this situation where our souls created some of these pathways of inertia in order for us to have to bust out of them and then evolve as part of that process. And aside from this kind of higher purpose way of leveraging the birth chart, there are super practical pieces of information gleaned. And some of those I discussed in the episodes on the personal planets, like, how to relate to other people, why you might find some things, more emotionally comfortable, communication styles, etc., etc. However, I am proof that it's never too late to use astrology to break through any limitations you may have unconsciously had placed on you or placed on yourself, depending on how you look at it. And another useful way to glean patterns is to look at the relationship of your sun and moon to one another. And I didn't know this when I started learning, but did you know that you can tell if you were born under a full moon or, say, a new moon, and every phase in between, just by eyeballing and then following up with a little bit of math, just by eyeballing those two in your chart. So let's start with the full moon. If your moon sits across from your sun, and if you're doing degrees, it would have to be 180 degrees to 225 degrees. This means you were born in the full phase of the moon, which makes you a bit of a werewolf. But really, because if you think about it, your ego self, your sun, and your emotional self, your moon, are in opposite signs, which is called a sign polarity. And they're in this aspect called an opposition, that even if you don't know anything about aspects, you can guess what kind of energy that is. So that energy means those signs don't easily understand one another or blend. And this can make for an individual who is flipping back and forth between extremes, or feeling kind of naked because the sun is always shining a light on their emotional self. And then another way you can use the sun-moon phase is to understand the relationship of the mother and father leading up to the birth. I won't get too much into this, but it's super, super interesting if you're nosy and you want to like understand your parents. And so a full moon in that line of investigation would indicate opposition really between the two, perhaps a case of opposites attracting and then not actually working. And I'm going to sneak in some math now. Astrology is very geometric, but I think what I'm going to describe is more just like basic addition and subtraction. So dust off your high school knowledge of circles, and you may remember that circles have 360 degrees. And in astrology, on the birth chart, each sign has 30 degrees. So 30 times 12 is 360. And you would then start at your sun, and then you're going to move counterclockwise around the wheel to your moon, and you would add up the degrees in between. Or alternatively, if you go clockwise, you end up subtracting that amount from 360. So in my case, my sun is at 27 degrees Leo and the moon is at 18 degrees Aries. So there are 3 degrees left of Leo. And then there are 30 degrees as I go around counterclockwise, 30 degrees per sign. And I've got 7 signs until I get to Aries. And then there's 18 degrees of Aries. So that would be 3 degrees left of Leo plus 210 degrees of those 7 times 30 plus the 18 degrees of Aries. And that gets me to 231 degrees. And this falls into the waning gibbous phase. It's also a trine aspect, but I won't go further into aspects in this episode. But I thought I'd mention it. If you're already familiar with them, you may want to note that when you're looking at the degrees of your sun and moon. And what life themes can this information reveal? Well, in evolutionary astrology, I would read the phases between all the planets, really, or at least between each planet and the sun, like in order to gain an understanding of the soul's intention of this in this life, like what have they really already practiced versus what's kind of new, and then go from there. But however, for today, for a general theme, I would refer to a couple of books, and one is Stephen Forrest's The Book of Water, where I pulled those earlier quotes from. Or the other is my astrologer friend, Narayana Montefiore, and her book called Moon Signs. And this little book is packed with information on your natal moon sign, the house placement, the phase, the progressed moon, and more. And in fact, I was gifted this book by my niece and my daughter. I want to say it might have just been last year on my birthday. And I loved it so much that I scheduled an initial moon reading with Narayana, and then I scheduled an Akashic Records reading with her, and then I just had a lunar return reading with her. And anyway, I could gush on, and I will definitely remind you when her next book comes out. And for the purposes of this podcast, what I think I'll do, because I love to get into the application of what I'm yapping about in these episodes. So what I'll do is I'll read from Stephen Forrest's book, and he gives these evocative descriptors of the personality type for each phase of the moon in relationship to the sun. And then I'll read just the keywords from Narayana's book that correspond to each phase. And then I would encourage you to check out both of their books because they also go into a more detailed description. And the moon phase personality descriptors in both of those books, it reminded me of tarot, and they have these things called birth cards that are associated with your birthday, and it draws from numerology, I believe, as well as astrology. And you can discover yours on the Labyrinthos website, which I love that. I have that app on my phone. That's how I've been learning tarot. And then, so the keywords that I'll read to you, plus maybe your tarot birth cards, they will likely tie in with some of those other themes that you've discovered so far by looking at the first couple of ways that I described in the first part of the episode. So the new moon, that would be 0 to 45 degrees ahead of the sun. Stephen Forrest calls this the teacher. And Narayana keywords are instinctual, initiating, creative, and spontaneous. The waxing crescent, that would be 45 to 90 degrees ahead of the sun. This is the extremist, and keywords growth, activation, manifestation, expansion. And then the first quarter, 90 degrees to 135 degrees ahead of the sun. This is the crusader, and the keywords action, inventive, challenging, building. Waxing gibbous is 135 to 180 ahead of the sun. This is the helper and the lover. The keywords evaluation, gestation, analytical, perfection. And the full moon, 180 degrees to 225 ahead of the sun. This is the human being. Keywords peak, awareness, fulfillment, opposition. The waning gibbous, 225 degrees to 270 degrees ahead of the sun. The shaman, the keywords dissemination, teaching, service, revealing. And the third quarter, or the last quarter moon, 270 to 315 degrees ahead of the sun. This is the pilgrim. And keywords integration, crisis, readjustment, creativity. And finally, the balsamic, or the waning crescent moon, is 315 to 360 degrees ahead of the sun. This is the mystic wanderer. Keywords recharging, preparation, closure, surrender. And using these concepts and keywords for my natal moon phase, as I was born under a waning gibbous moon, my life path will look like that of a shaman and will involve some aspects related to the keywords. And it really does also tie in with my tarot birth cards, which are the moon and the hermit. And all of that together just highlights that Virgo Pisces polarity that I talked about, that I'm really meant to explore in this life, as well as my abilities to access energies and other realms, as a shaman does. You know, that's also in those themes I discussed earlier. I hope these concepts and examples will be useful to you as you explore your own chart and reflect upon what you find there. And you know, I remember when I was in high school, there was this book that we used to figure out which professions would be a good match for us. And I think, I'll link it, but I think it was called What Color is Your Parachute? I can't really remember how that book worked. But now I'm wondering if they somehow used astrology. But anyway, if you did something like that, or the Myers-Briggs, or another sort of personality quiz, you will find more depth, just kind of endless ability to explore all the nooks and crannies of your birth chart, beginning with the major themes that I described today. So it would definitely be an upgrade no matter how you started looking at your personality and your life themes. And if I had to pick one next step that may prove complementary to what I have described here, it might be to explore the nodes of the moon, also known as the north and south nodes, which get at the experiences and skills that we bring to this life and the experiences and lessons we are meant to have in order to integrate it all together for our evolution. I love Elizabeth Spring's books, and you may be able to find some of her old podcast episodes, or Jan Spiller's book, Astrology for the Soul. Of course, I'll link to both of those. And also, if you want to look at your personal evolutionary astrology, or even experience a past life and have a conversation with your soul, You can do that with me as your guide. I would love to have you. And thank you for listening. You are now empowered to be consciously curious about themes in your birth chart. And please do share this podcast so you can talk about it with your friends and empower more people, and rate and review it if you have the time. If you want to work with me personally, I'll put some info in the show notes, including a coupon code. If it's still too pricey, just email me. We'll figure something out. And I also have some very affordable hypnotic tracks and just astrology guides on my website too, if you want to check those out and not have to fast forward through the podcast episodes to get to the hypnotic track, if you like to use them regularly. That's about all the salesmanship that I can do today. And I thank you again so much. And I wish you a beautiful day.